Forgiveness is a virtue that is rejected by our modern culture in a lot of ways.
Why is forgiveness such an important aspect of a Christian's life? How can we forgive even in the cruelest of sins done toward us?
Today we're going to be talking about this hard but very important subject. Welcome to the Pilgrim Song. Welcome to episode 27 of the Pilgrim Song. I'm Alexander.
And I'm Charlie.
And this is the podcast where your two favorite interracial friends talk about Jesus. So glad to be back with y'all for another week. Happy Monday. I am apologizing right now. I'm going to start off by apologizing because I did not get the website up this week. Life is the way it goes.
But you know what? They're going to forgive you for that.
Oh.
Because that's what you're supposed to do.
You better.
Because this week on the Pilgrim Song, we are talking about forgiveness, which is something that I think is extremely important for us because it's the attitude that we're supposed to have as Christians, this forgiving attitude, but I think it's something that can be difficult. And I think sometimes we can misdefine what it actually is. And so today we're going to look at how we're able to do that in our lives, even when it's really, really difficult sometimes, how we can let things go and forgive somebody else.
Absolutely. Brilliant segue. That is some excellent segue skills there. We're going to open up by reading a little quote from C.S. Lewis's classic, Mere Christianity. Incredible book if you haven't read it for yourself. I would highly recommend it. We might be talking about it on the podcast a little bit more sometime. But he opens his chapter by saying that everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive, as we had during the war. And he's speaking about World War II there. He says, and then to mention the subject at all is to be greeted with howls of anger. It is not that people think it too high and difficult a virtue. It is that they think it is hateful and contemptible. That sort of talk makes me sick, they say. And half of you already want to ask me, I wonder how you'd feel about forgiving the Gestapo if you were a Pole or a Jew. So as he opens his chapter, he talks about the reality of forgiveness, both in his culture, like in the 1940s, and our modern culture, where forgiveness, in theory, it's super nice. Like, look at how wonderful it is. But in actuality, people do real damage and real harm and say offensive things and do unkind things. This plays a little bit, at least from my perspective, into cancel culture and the idea of, the cancel culture has gotten so far where people are getting doxxed and people's families are being put in danger because someone won't forgive them for whatever they said or did. Again, forgiveness is not to say that nothing that you did not hurt or it didn't offend or wasn't wrong, but it does take the burden certainly off of our shoulders. So we're going to be talking about what forgiveness is, and Charlie's going to be opening us up here. So
the first thing we want to ask is why it's important. And when we think about the importance of forgiveness, and like you were talking about, like the weight of forgiveness sometimes and what that can mean, the story that comes to my mind is in Matthew chapter 18. And in Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 21, it says, Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle one, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused, and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you pleaded with me. And should you not now have mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in his anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. So in this passage, right, we have Peter asks Jesus a genuine question, and that is, how many times am I supposed to forgive somebody that sins against me? Which I think is something that, a lot of us ask, especially when, someone that we know continuously wrongs us with the same thing over and over again. Like, how many times am I supposed to forgive this person before I'm finally like, you know what, no, I don't forgive you anymore?
Do you think that Peter thought 7 times was a lot?
Maybe.
I think he did.
Yeah.
7 times is a lot to forgive somebody.
It is. Especially if it's something really like difficult. That can be really hard. It can be hard to just do it the first time. Jesus says 70 times 7. So we forgive someone 490 times and we're done. I remember doing that in Bible class when I was a kid. I was like, teacher, it's 490 times and then I don't have to forgive them anymore. But no, what Jesus is saying is there is no limit to how many times you're supposed to forgive your brother. And the way that he illustrates this is a story about a master and his servants. So there's a servant who owes, 10,000 talents. That is an unpayable debt. That's something that there is no chance that a servant could ever pay back to his master. That is something that we would look at. It's an unpayable thing. Their money system is different than ours. But, there's really no way for us to quantify how much money that's going to be. It's lifetimes of work that he would owe this master. And so the master, instead of imprisoning him, which he had every right to do, or sell him, he decided to have pity on him when he begged him to forgive him and forgave him of that massive debt. Yet that servant then immediately forgets about that, turns around and goes and finds one of the people that owes him money, which is 100 denarii, would be 100 days of work. It's a lot, but it's payable, unlike his 10,000 talents. And instead of showing the same love and mercy that his master showed for him, he throws him in jail until he repays him. The master finds out and then ends up throwing him in jail because of the way that he dealt with him. And so this points out a lot of things to us. And I think the main thing is that the first reason why we want to forgive people is because of what God has done for us. When we read passages like Ephesians 4:32 and Matthew 6:14, we see that we are those servants. Right? We are the people that have the unforgivable debt. The amount of wrong that we have done toward God, as far as literally killing God, killing Jesus. And Jesus is the one telling this story. He knows that they're going to turn around and kill him. Says that even though you're going to put me to death and wrong me in the worst possible way, that's why I'm doing this, is because I can forgive you, because I can cover that up, right? I'm going to pay what you could never pay. So you should be able to pay, you should be able to forgive what other people owe you. And
that's what even Jesus does beyond what is done in this story, where he doesn't say, the master doesn't say, oh, well, I'm never going to ask for this debt. He's like, as a matter of fact, he's like, I'll pay it back. And he's like, okay. Jesus takes that debt upon himself. He says, I will pay your 10,000 talents. So.
And so if we don't embody that idea of forgiveness, if we're not willing to be patient and suffer long with people, even when they wrong us in some really, really cruel ways, if we're not willing to forgive them of that, then we're hypocrites. Because the reason why we're Christians is because we accepted that forgiveness from Jesus, because we accepted his love for us and took that forgiveness that he offered us. And so if we're not going to be willing to go and give that to somebody else, then we're just hypocrites, which I don't think any of us want to be.
No. This story has been really impactful for me. It bothers me when I read it, and I think, well, that's what the Bible is supposed to do, is bother me because of how awful I am at this, and how dumb the grudges I hold are. It's like, in comparison, in the grand scheme of things, it's ridiculous to hold on to that. I also imagine the apostles, after he tells them this story, this parable, and then coming back to it or thinking about it after Jesus is resurrected and knowing what that means to them. It would take on so much more of a weight, and just seeing that click, I think. Also, one thing I want to bring out about the story as well is the 100 denarii. Charlie already mentioned that it's 100 days of work, so it's not like nothing. And this isn't to say that, again, that when people harm you, when people do you wrong, it's not to say that the debt doesn't hurt and that what they've done doesn't actually have an effect. But when we contextualize it with how the cross, what Jesus gave up for us, what he did for us, that is what makes it possible. And that's where we that's where you have to draw that strength from, I think, to forgive.
And so that's obviously some really good spiritual reasons why. But I think there's also some like other reasons as to why you should be willing to forgive too. And I think one of those is like just your mental health in general. Like you mentioned with holding grudges, something that I know that I'm guilty of, and I think a lot of us are, is, not only do we not forgive somebody, we never forget about it, right? Mm-hmm. We're just going to sit there. It's going to ruin our relationship with people. We're not going to, make eye contact with people. We're not going to talk to people because of just this grudge that we hold against them, and we will not let it go, whether that's because they don't ask for forgiveness, even though they may not realize they've wronged us, or right, maybe they've asked and it was just too much. We just couldn't, maybe we're like, yeah, I forgive you, whatever, but then you just keep holding it. That is detrimental for your mental health. That's a burden that you're now going to have to carry with you every day, even though, that person may have a burden that they owe to you, or they have something that they've wronged you with. They're carrying the burden. So now you're putting this on yourself in that situation. So I think it's good for you to be able to let stuff go and to be able to move past things. It's good for you. It's good for the people that you're in relationships with. So that's why it's important to forgive. But like you talked about, just because it's important to does not mean that it's going to be easy to, because sometimes the things that people do to us really, really hurt. And so that's what we're going to talk about in our next section when we come back, which is answering the question as to why it is so difficult sometimes for us to forgive others.
So why is it so hard to forgive? Just in general, but also there's a lot of reasons. So just from the get-go, we have C.S. Lewis's example from the beginning, if you remember back to that. C.S. Lewis talks about the Gestapo, actually Nazi police force that hunted and killed Poles and Jews. How could you possibly forgive people for doing something like that? That's obnoxious. That's disgusting and disturbing. I also think of the example of victims of any sort, both of the reality is it's just completely unfair. They're being treated with contempt, and they haven't done anything themselves. So whether it be sexual or domestic or whatever abuse that they've had, they haven't brought it upon themselves. It's just some evil person who does it to them. Mm-hmm. So how could you forgive someone like that? People have feelings towards the government and government of any nation. Deportations are that weighs heavy on a lot of people. Not caring for the poor, awful foster care systems, exaltation of the wealthy while stepping on the impoverished, and the list goes on and on about why you would have frustrations with a nation, with a government, or anything like that. When someone does something that like separating your family, all this type of stuff to you, it would make it very hard to forgive. There's a lot of examples that come up in the church, right? That you're held to a higher standard of holiness. This is when you come to service and you say, I'm a Christian, I'm trying to follow Jesus. And then other people, they do something to hurt you or your family while you're going to church with them. They make you feel like a bad Christian. And it's not because you're not living up to the standard of Jesus. It's because you're not living up to their standard. And they judge it based upon the moving target of how they operate. The horror stories are real about what's happened in churches and the type of judgment that happens. So how can you forgive someone in a situation like that? And those are some really big ones. So those are some pretty deep ones.
Yeah, and I think it depends too, like really on, it can make it even worse depending on who it is that's wronged you. When you think about, like, we talked to like friends last week, think about those people that you have put your trust into, that you have been vulnerable with, whether that's your friend, whether that's your spouse, if you're married. Those are the people that you care for the most. Those are the people that can help you the most, but they're also the people that can hurt you the most too. Because you put so much trust into those people, they could easily destroy that trust by turning around and holding that, doing something against you, or telling other people about something that you're struggling with, the various things. And so, the closer you are with somebody, I feel like almost the more difficult it can be sometimes to forgive them. When you think about things like a spouse being unfaithful, I know a lot of examples where that has happened in the home and the spouse has forgiven the other one and they've been able to stay together and work through that, and how it blows my mind and how fantastic that is when that occurs. But also I understand that that's probably something that's really, really difficult to do and overcome. When you are talking to your friend about something that you're struggling with and you open up to them and you say, hey, I've really been dealing with, X or Y, and this has really been something that's on my mind. And then you find out like a week later that they've gone and told somebody else about that because someone comes to you and says, hey, I heard you were struggling with this, and you find out it was your friend. That hurts.
Yeah.
Not only do you not want to forgive that person, but you don't want to talk to them anymore because you're afraid of what they're going to do. So that can make it really difficult to forgive. And that can make it really difficult to move on from different things. So, yeah, there's big things that people can do, but also it can be a little thing that someone really close to you does that can also make it difficult.
That's a good point, too. I didn't even consider that aspect. But, yeah, when someone who is close to you and you've put this amount of trust and time into, your expectation is that they're not going to let you down. So that does weigh really heavily on people.
For sure.
So that is part, like, those things are, again, the examples I used are pretty deep, of not like, I mean, they're shallow in a way, but it's just that pain is so real.
Heavy things.
Heavy things. That, like, abuse, any sort of racism, any of that type of stuff, what has happened with the government, all those things are real painful struggles. And not to say like, so they're examples, but a lot of times the struggles that we go through are just kind of small things. I know one, as Charlie mentioned, he struggles with grudges. I struggle with grudges, because, and for me, it's been people, like, something will happen to me. Someone will do something to me. It offends me and it bothers me. And I don't say a word to them. Yep. And I just sit there and let it stew and let it bother me. And they aren't hurt, as Charlie mentioned again, they aren't hurting from it. I'm the only one who's hurting from it. And it's honestly very childlike behavior where I'm refusing to forgive even when they don't know that they've done anything wrong. But the way to contextualize forgiveness and why we forgive is centered on the message of the gospel. And as Charlie mentioned, the weight and the things that we owe Christ, it is unforgivable. We do not deserve forgiveness. We have not earned forgiveness. Every single day we fail to live up to the standard that Christ calls us to and what he holds us to. So when we refuse to forgive, we are as foolish as a man who owes 10,000 talents, choking somebody else out for bothering us with the 100. Yeah. So with the cross and the words that always shake me when I'm reading through the crucifixion story, no matter, it's like something new hits me every time I read through the crucifixion story. But the words that always get me is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They don't know the weight of what they're doing. And Jesus' reaction isn't cursing all of them, saying they're all terrible people, you got the wrong guy, you got an innocent person. Father, forgive them. And if Jesus can do that for us, as difficult as it is to forgive people, Jesus calls us to the standard, and he gives us the power and the strength to get through those difficult times and to forgive, especially when it hurts. So.
Yeah, and I think, another thing too that can make it really difficult is when that person is not seeking forgiveness. Whether it's because they don't realize that they've wronged you, or maybe they do and they're just really mean. they just don't care. Yeah. And the story that comes to my mind when I think about that, there's two. There's obviously Jesus, right, when he's dying on the cross. And he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Because those Roman guards were not asking for forgiveness. The Pharisees and the people that wanted to put him to death, they were not asking for forgiveness because in their mind they were justified for what they were doing. And Jesus says, no, I forgive you. Even though you're not seeking it, I forgive you. It doesn't matter. That can be really, really difficult. But the other person too is one that's very familiar to that, or very similar to that story, and that's with Stephen. So Stephen was obviously a very, very strong disciple, worked closely with the 12, was chosen to be a helper for them, was a strong follower of Jesus. He was arrested, prosecuted, treated very unfairly, very similar to Jesus. Yeah. But at the end of his life in Acts chapter 7, after he finishes, going up against the Sanhedrin Council,
him a tongue lashing,
and just absolutely roast them for what they have done to Jesus, they take him out of the city. And beginning in verse 58 of chapter 7, it says, "They cast him out of the city and they stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of the young man named Saul. And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, 'Lord Jesus, receive my spirit.' And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lord, do not hold this sin against them.' And when he had said this, he breathed his last." It's a very mirrors Jesus on the cross, in my opinion. Again, he was being stoned by this group of Jewish scholars that were they were the head people. Yeah. And they were not asking for forgiveness because, once again, in their mind, they were completely justified for what they're doing because what they were accusing him of was blasphemy. And under Jewish law, and under the law in which they were still living by, the punishment for blasphemy is being stoned. So in their mind, they're actually following the law, when in the reality situation is they're not. And Stephen, instead of cursing them as he dies or asking to be avenged, he says, "Lord, forgive. Don't hold this against them." And that's powerful. And that's really difficult for me because someone may say something against me. Someone may break my trust down, but I'm still alive today. No one has tried to kill me that I know of. And if I'm in that situation, I don't know if I have that level of strength to be willing to forgive them in that moment and not, want to be avenged. And so, yeah. Again, it's difficult when someone doesn't want to be forgiven or isn't seeking forgiveness. We have that in our minds that we only have to forgive people when they say they're sorry. But that's not necessarily true. Yeah. And in fact, that's not true because that's not the example that Jesus shows us. And that's not the example that Stephen shows us either here.
But I just, now I'm thinking about it that you brought up this story. I'm thinking of the picture of Stephen meeting Paul in heaven.
Yeah.
And, he's just, this is my brother. This is like, man, I got goosebumps.
Yeah.
Dog, we need to forgive each other.
And the fact that...
And it's difficult. But
Saul, literally right after this, is a picture of someone who is forgiven.
Yeah.
Because he's on the road to Damascus and Jesus, makes him an apostle by showing himself to him. So, yeah, I wonder if Jesus heard Stephen calling this out and Saul standing there and was like, this is, that's just funny. Like, this is going to be one of what we would probably see is like, top apostles does so much. Paul's like definitely up there. Yet we see him here killing somebody.
He starts as a murderer.
Yeah.
So, that's, forgiveness, again, it is the reason it's rejected in culture is because it is so unfair. It's not right that Stephen, as he's being killed by people, says, "Oh, don't hold this thing against them." That's ridiculous. They should be held against them. But that is the reality of the gospel, is that debt has been wiped clean if you simply accept.
Yep.
And that is a wonderful gift. And for Christians, when we talk about forgiveness, that means we have to be imitating the forgiveness that's been shown to us first. So, you have anything else you want to talk about why it's difficult to forgive?
I don't. And, we don't know you and your situation.
It's true.
And we don't know what people have done against you. Because maybe you are holding something against somebody right now. Or maybe someone has wronged you. Maybe you are listening to this while you're driving and someone is cutting you off in the middle of this. And, right, different things are going to be difficult for different people. What I may look at you and say, oh, that's not that bad. Like, you could forgive that. To you, may be something very difficult, and vice versa. There may be something that I've had struggled with forgiving somebody for that you may say, oh, that's just easy. Like, why would you hold that as a grudge? Like, let it go, man. But the reality is it might really, really be hard for me to. So no matter what your situation is, right, no matter what that is for you, no matter how hard it is, at the end of the day, you've accepted the forgiveness from Jesus. And so that's what you're supposed to be paying back, like you talked about. Don't be a hypocrite.
Don't be a hypocrite.
Love people. Bringing it back.
Every time.
Loving somebody means you're going to forgive them when they wrong you. All kinds of love.
Alrighty. So, love people, of course. We have one more section to go, and we'll be right back to talk about what forgiveness really looks like.
What we want to close with is some kind of practical application, and that is, what does forgiveness look like for us today? What does it look like in reality? How do we actually forgive somebody? So I think to start off with, we've been talking a lot of examples about how we forgive other people. One thing that we haven't really talked about too is also being able to forgive yourself. Because I think that's kind of where you got to start with, right? Each and every one of us carries baggage with us, things that we, that we've done in our past. Maybe it was a long time ago. Maybe it was somewhat recently, and we're struggling with it. And it may not be something that we necessarily did against somebody. Maybe it's just something that we know that we're guilty of, and we've been holding it against ourselves. Or maybe we did wrong somebody. That person forgave us, but yet we're the ones that really still can't let that thing go. And so what we have to be able to do is, relieve ourselves of that burden, to be able to forgive ourselves. Because if we can forgive ourselves, if we understand how to do that, then I think it will be easier for us to be able to forgive other people too and not hold those things against them. So the one person that probably comes to mind for, someone that I know that would have had to have struggled with this, and we see it in his letters, is Paul. We just talked about there with Stephen. He wasn't one of the ones that actively stoning Stephen in that story. He was holding people's coats. But we know as Paul grew up, he became a very heavy persecutor of the church, dragging people into court to be killed, if not doing it himself. And yet we see him turn a complete 180 from the direction that he was going in, realizing that all the stuff that he thought that he was doing right, he thought he was being a great follower of God. Turns out he was doing the exact opposite and being a terrible follower of God. He was no longer serving God in the way that he thought that he was supposed to be. That's a really interesting thing to me, because when you think about Paul, he was following the law, just the wrong one. And so how difficult that would have been. And I think we see that in his writing sometimes when he talks about all the things that he, had done in his past life, especially when he was justifying himself to Jews. You want to think that you're a good Jew? Here's what I was as a Jew. I literally killed Christians because I thought that they were being blasphemous. Yeah. I was, studying at the feet of Gamaliel, right? He would have likely sat on the Sanhedrin Council more than likely as he got older someday. So he had kind of his whole life before him. Yet when Jesus comes to him and says, hey, what are you doing? You're doing this wrong. Follow me, not the old law. He immediately changes. and he becomes a very strong apostle for Jesus. But yet all those things that he had done in his past, he still carried those things with him. But instead of holding that against himself, instead of letting that get him down and letting that keep him and hindering him from taking the word of God to all different parts of the world, he used that to motivate him to be a better follower of Jesus, right? I know that I am guilty of all these things. So letting that get me down, I'm going to let that motivate me to be even better. I'm going to use that to fuel my desire to serve Jesus because I know what I've been forgiven of. Like, I know everything that I did wrong. So I'm gonna let that motivate me. So
and when we think about Paul, I think he could have focused a lot on his personal unworthiness. And the reality is all of us are unworthy of the gift we've received in Jesus. So we have to kind of take our minds off of once Jesus has forgiven us, that gives us the room to forgive ourselves and just move forward and seek to glorify him in our lives. So
And again, that it's not easy. Especially when we know we've done some pretty bad things. I know that there's stuff that I'm guilty of that I still haven't fully let go and been able to release. And so, I think that's different for different people and how you're going to be able to let those things go, how you're going to be able to relieve yourself of some of that baggage. But I think that comes through, some talking with people about it, not just keeping it into yourself, but being open with friends. Being open if you're married to your spouse, maybe seeking after outside with therapy to work through some of the things that you've done to go through. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But then also talking to God about those things as well, because he knows about it. And so praying to God, right? Recognizing, the fact that Jesus has let it go, recognizing, how much Jesus has done for you. And, know that that's not something that you're going to be held against because you have been forgiven and being able to let that go. And so that's where you should start. If you want to start forgiving people, start by forgiving yourself. And then once you've done that, I think you can move on to being able to forgive other people in a better way.
For sure.
And that brings up the other aspect of forgiveness too, that I know we talk about, but sometimes it's difficult too. And that is forgiving is not just telling someone, hey, you're released from your bonds from me. But it's also the idea that I am going to forget that ever even happened. I am going to let that go. I am not going to hold this grudge. Right? When I say that I forgive you, I mean it. I'm not going to bring this up, 5-10 years later because I have forgiven you, because I have let this go. Like that debt has been paid, which can also be just as difficult as doing the forgiving itself. But they're one and the same, right? Yeah. I think, when you define forgiveness, I think the idea of forgetting, it's part of the definition of forgiveness. I don't think you can separate those two things. I think they have to be one and the same. Yeah.
I think we get really tied to the power of having something over somebody, and we're like, we want to hold on to this. I've forgiven you, sure, but I'm just going to make sure you remember this.
And you mess up again, I'm going to,
it's going to be
really bad because I'm going to bring this up.
That's just not the way that Jesus has forgiven us. Yeah. So we can't hold we can't act the same way there.
For sure.
So, the biggest example of forgiveness, how this looks, is obviously in Jesus and what he's done for us. And the reality of forgiveness for us, there is not a single soul on this planet Earth, no matter how awful they have been, no matter how awful they continue to be, Jesus is willing to, as soon as you accept him and you respond to the message of the gospel, he is so quick to forgive you. All it takes is repentance. So that's really incredible. Of course, that's it. Just to know that every sin that we commit against other people is being done to him. He takes that directly. To know that is all the things that have been done throughout history, he is so quick to forgive us. It's very mind-boggling. Another example is that I look to, I don't know how many times we mentioned Barnabas in this podcast, but he's just going to keep coming up because he's the best. So Barnabas is, when we think about him, like, I don't think there's anything he could directly be like, okay, he needed to be forgiven directly. But when we think about the example of Paul, and Paul is persecuting people in Jerusalem, and that is where Barnabas is going to church. So Barnabas no doubt knew of people who were stripped from their homes and killed because of what Saul at the time, had been doing. And what his reaction is, Barnabas, when Paul repents and he comes to Jerusalem and everybody's terrified of him, and for good reason, Barnabas is like, we need to welcome him in. He's been saved. He's become one with the Lord. And the reason that Paul even has the opportunity he does in Jerusalem is because one person was quick to forgive. And that's a really incredible story there. It also factors in with John Mark. If you read through the Acts in the first missionary journey, John Mark bails out. We don't know the reason exactly, but he bails out midway through the journey. Mm-hmm. And Paul does not want to go on a journey with him again. And so Barnabas and him split up, and it's kind of like this sad thing that happens there. But later, Paul calls John Mark a close disciple, a close friend. Peter also talks about him in his letters as well. So whatever Barnabas did, the quickness to forgive in that situation made a disciple of Jesus who was able to support both Paul and Peter in some way. Mm-hmm. And that's what it took, was forgiving him and saying, I'm going to help you out. I'll take you under my wing. We're going to work through this together.
They still went around preaching, just different places than Paul.
So it's just so important for us that forgiveness, it rebuilds the bridge, knowing that, you messed up. I'm not going to say that you didn't mess up, but despite your mess up, I still love you and care about you, and I just want you to do the best. And he expected a lot out of John Mark, so he got it out of him. So
yeah.
You have anything to say on that?
No, I mean, we've talked about, a lot of things that have happened in the Bible. But let's bring it to modern day, right? Mm. I think you have some really good examples of some things that have happened recently that we can look at as good examples of this as well.
Yes. So this is my, when we were talking about this podcast, I couldn't have thought of a better thing that happened. So my modern day example comes September of 2018. There's a man named Botham Jean, and he was killed in an apartment by an off-duty police officer, Amber Geiger. So Amber Geiger, she walks into the wrong apartment, thinks that he's in there stealing from her, and the story gets a little discombobulated about like what exactly happens. But what did happen was Botham was killed in this incident. So it's very sad, really awful story. Botham was a believer in Jesus, so I'm confident that I'll be able to see him in heaven, and that's wonderful. And his life does have comfort now. But the reality is he's dead, and his family has to live with that, and Amber has to live with the consequences of that. When Amber was being sentenced in 2019, she was sentenced for 10 years for manslaughter. And when he was delivering an victim impact statement, Botham's brother Brant delivers this speech. And when I read it, eyes get a little bit misty. It's really powerful. So he responds as he's talking. He says, "I love you just like anyone else, and I'm not going to hope you rot and die. I personally want the best for you. I wasn't going to say this in front of my family. I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you because I know that's exactly what Botham would want for you. Give your life to Christ. And I think giving your life to Christ is the best thing Botham would want for you." And then he seals it with a hug. I did a lot of research on this story because, that hug kind of became famous and infamous. And Brant literally admits that for a long time, I hated her and I was disgusted. And then he comes to this realization, as she's being sentenced and all this type of stuff. And ultimately he talks about Christ in his heart. It's like, I cannot hold that burden against you. That's not something, Christ hasn't held that against me. I can't hold it against you either. So if you haven't seen this clip, if you haven't seen it, it is amazing. And you can tell that Amber she has been hated and maligned and all this type of stuff. As far as I understand, it was just an accident. But, she's been destroyed online, all this type of stuff. And you could feel, I think she felt like the entire world was against her, especially this family. But then Brant shows, genuine love of Christ. And that's something we need to be showing more, of course. But the reaction is, just as C.S. Lewis said in 1940, things haven't changed. People still howl at this. There's a minister, or not that part yet. One CNN analyst named Bakari Sellers, she tweeted, "Why do black folks always have to forgive?" We can have a conversation about black folk and our unconscionable forgiveness in the face of hate and violence. I don't get it. Yes, you don't get forgiveness if you aren't in Christ. It doesn't make sense. But it's what he's done for us, and that's what contextualizes it. AME, American Methodist Episcopal Church, for y'all who are not, I almost said religiously woke. Just, whatever. For people who do not know, this guy, he's a minister in the church, and he said that I have preached forgiveness for 25 years, but using the willingness of black people to forgive as an excuse to further victimize black people is sinful. America should ask black people for forgiveness for serially asking African Americans to forgive sanctioned police brutality. I don't know what you were preaching about forgiveness when you decided to tweet this, because it's not forgiveness, whatever it is. Asking America as a whole to repent of sins and all that type of stuff. You can ask individual people, first of all, to do that. You need to be repentant. But forgiveness, as we've already mentioned, it's not about has someone asked for forgiveness first. It's about forgiving on the basis of what Jesus has already done. Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King, unfortunately too, she said that God bless Botham Jean's brother, Brant. She says, but don't confuse his forgiveness with absolving this nation for its gross, bitter discrimination against black people in a myriad of its systems and policies. Racism and white supremacist ideology can't be hugged out. I think the depth of forgiveness, perhaps it can be. Because if people are willing to forgive you for holding these bigoted and unbiblical and just disgusting beliefs, if someone is willing to forgive you on that basis, that changes lives. The forgiveness that Christ gave me, and the forgiveness that Christ has given Charlie, the forgiveness that Christ gave Paul and Peter, everyone, it radically changed people's lives. So stop throwing away forgiveness like it doesn't mean anything. If it's in Christ, it means a lot. And then one person put, just a commenter said that I, for one, am done forgiving. Thank God that Jesus does not have that attitude. Mm-hmm. To conclude, forgiveness is nice in theory. In reality, it is beyond difficult. It is no doubt how hard that would be for Brant to do that. And it's hard for us to forgive because a lot of things, again, there's a lot of stuff that happens to us that's unfair and just not right. But if you know what you have done personally to the Lord Jesus and the fact that he hangs on a cross and responds to you, Father, forgive him or her, they know not what they do. That contextualizes everything else we do from that point on. Because it's no longer about me. It's all about how I can replicate the forgiveness and love that Jesus has already shown me back onto the world. So, to conclude, forgive people. That's it. And, love them, as we keep mentioning. You have anything to say to that, Charlie?
There's nothing else I can add to that. That was extremely powerful, and I'm thankful that you pulled all those examples and did all the research on that. And, I can tell that weighs heavily on you.
Yeah.
But there's no better example. Yeah. Modern day examples of things that we read about. And sometimes those can mean just as much to us because we actually see them happen. I remember that happening and seeing all the criticism.
You better. I did a lesson on it.
Yeah, I do actually. I do remember the lesson. Yeah, you had the picture of it in your slides.
I did, yeah.
But
yeah. So this is an important topic, whatever. And again, we hope you enjoy this, but at the same time that it convicts you because this clearly convicts us. We do not read Matthew 18 lightly because I know how guilty I am of that. So thank you guys again for listening to the Pilgrim song. We appreciate so much your support and all your listens, and it's growing quite a little bit. So we hope that you'll just keep sharing it and keep listening, and we hope that this blesses you. Y'all have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next one.